Welcome to White Shadows. Today I am going to tell you about the scariest camping stories shared by people on Reddit. So bring your flashlights on the journey and let darkness take control. The first story is told by the user named scottismynameduh. I was camping alone in Northeast Ohio on my third and final night. I woke up in the middle of the night to take a leak, and as I stepped about 10 feet from my hammock, I spotted a headlamp about 80 to 100 feet away. I watched it for around 10 minutes, seeing someone stand up and sit down a few times. I quickly put on my boots, grabbed my hatchet, and decided to head to the right of my campsite to find out what was going on. As I moved about 50 yards from my site and started heading toward the light, I noticed another headlamp, this one only about 40 feet from me, moving around. I dropped to the ground, covered myself with some leaves. The person passed by within 10 feet of where I was hiding. He stopped, lit a cigarette, and finished a beer, tossing the can on the ground. After he moved far enough away that he couldn't hear me, I got up and started heading toward the first guy. I got close enough to him to hear his phone buzzing with messages. I quietly crept closer, just in time to see the glow of his phone light up his face. That's when he stood up and began walking toward my hammock. I stayed low, waiting for a moment, then made my way back to my site. I froze when I started hearing my tarp above my hammock being destroyed, and I saw flashlights moving around. I heard my big flashlight turn on and off, followed by my mess kit being tossed around. And then I overheard them talking about how he was just here. I stayed hidden behind the tree, watching the flashlights until they faded into the distance. When the sun came up and I returned to my site, everything was wrecked. My hammock and tarp had been slashed, likely with a machete. My mess kit was crushed, and my backpack, rain gear, and flashlight were all gone. I went to the spot where I had seen the first guy and found some chew pouches, 8 empty beer cans, and a discarded lighter. I then walked to where I had seen the other guy and found an empty bag of meth, a pile of cigarette butts, and a mess of human feces with no toilet paper in sight. The next story is told by user named oddrecognition3810. This past weekend, my partner and I decided to head to our usual camping spot. It's a very low-key place, typically empty, with only 1 or 2 people scattered across the mountain. Even then, they're miles away from our campsite. It's not a well-known spot, and we've been going there for years, always bringing my parents' elderly little dog along. We set up camp, had some food, and relaxed with a few beers by the fire. Before we set up, we scoped out the area to check how busy it was. There was absolutely no one around. The whole mountain was deserted, which is unusual for us. Usually, we'll encounter at least one hunter or fisherman, but not this time. We were completely alone, and everything felt peaceful. My dog stayed close by, just as he always does. Later, when we decided to settle in for the night, my normally calm and easygoing pup wouldn't settle inside the tent. It was a hot night, so we left the tent unzipped, with just a mesh covering the opening to let in some air. But the dog kept sniffing and staring through the mesh, clearly focused on something outside. Curious, we decided to get up and check the campsite for anything unusual, but we didn't see anything. We went back to the fire, thinking it was nothing, but then my dog suddenly went on high alert, his hackles raised and growling deeply in one direction in the woods. We grabbed our hunting knife and axe, listening closely as the dog continued to growl and bark, something completely out of character for him. He had always been so calm and comfortable on previous trips. After hours of him acting restless, we decided to turn on the truck lights to flood the camp with light, hoping to see whatever was causing him to act so strangely. We sat in the truck, our hearts racing, trying to figure out what he could be reacting to. After a few minutes, the dog lay down, but then he suddenly started growling again, much more aggressively this time. We were so startled by his reaction that we made a run for the truck. Once inside, we waited, trying to see if anything would reveal itself in the darkness. We stayed like that for about 30 minutes, thinking whatever was had finally moved on. But when we returned to the fire, my dog's hackles were still up, and then we heard the loudest snap of a tree branch, only about 10 feet from us, in the pitch-black wilderness. That was enough for us. We jumped back in the truck, taking the dog with us, and decided it was time to leave. Earlier that night, we had heard wolves howling in the distance, hunting for hours, and the eerie sound echoed through the woods. Our biggest concern was a cougar, which is common in the area, and there had been reports of attacks. We couldn't shake the feeling that something had been stalking us all night, and it hadn't moved on. We called my partner's parents to let them know we were leaving. Of course, they mocked us, calling us chicken shits for leaving. We were armed with little more than a knife and axe, definitely not enough to handle a mountain lion or a pack of wolves. They laughed at us the whole weekend. But I was more concerned about my small dog, especially with how on edge he was. Better safe than sorry, I thought. The next one is from the user named Entmoot76. I used to enjoy going out to my grandparents' property, which was way out in the middle of nowhere, and camping alone. I'd wander into the woods, find a random spot, and make it my campsite for the night. My dad once mentioned that there used to be an old farmstead nearby a long time ago, but I'm not sure how true that is. One night, I built myself a half-face brush shelter and slept fairly well. It was early morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise. I had pulled a light blanket over my face, thin enough that I could see through it a bit. As I started to wake up, I noticed what looked like two men standing outside my shelter, staring down at me. I couldn't make out their faces, but they were wearing old-fashioned, wide-brimmed hats. Not cowboy hats, but the kind settlers used to wear. They didn't move or say anything, just stood there, watching me like they were curious. I fully woke up, pulled the blanket down quickly, and when I looked, there was nobody there. I'm sure it was just a dream, or maybe not. Don't go anywhere. The last one is still left. This story is from user named TalkoSkeva. Two strange incidents in one night, both involving the same friend, and both related to my need to use the bathroom. Around 10 p.m., I suddenly had to go. The restrooms were about a quarter mile away, so I headed out into the pitch-dark woods. As I walked, I spotted one of my friends emerging from a path that led to an unused site and onto the main path. The unused site path was a good 50 yards from our campsite, so I knew it was him, especially since he has a very distinct and noticeable gait. At several points, he turned around and asked, "Why are you following me?" even though he was always a good 40 feet ahead of me. I reply, "I literally told you guys I was going to the bathroom," and asked, "Why did you come from a different site?" He picked up his pace, and eventually I lost sight of him in the darkness. I made it to the restrooms without seeing him again, did my business, and started heading back to the campsite. When I returned, there he was, back at the site. I asked him why he was messing with me, but everyone else swore he had never even left. All right, they were just messing with me. No big deal. Then, around 3 a.m., I woke up needing to pee again. This time, I didn't bother walking to the restrooms and decided to just go off into the woods. When I finished and was heading back, I heard the unmistakable sound of a tent zipper opening. In the darkness, I could tell it was my friend, and I heard him zip it back up. As I got closer to the tents, I saw him more clearly. He walked a bit, then lit a cigarette. I could see his face in the light from the flint strikes, and even more clearly when the lighter caught. He took a puff and said, "Can you hear me?" I replied, "Yeah, I can hear you. What's up?" Then, much louder this time, he said, "Can you hear me?" I answered, "Yeah, you trying to wake everyone up?" He shook his head and turned, walking toward the cars. I was about 30 feet behind him, thinking he was messing with me again, so I followed. I lost sight of him behind a car. When I walked around the corner, he was gone. I was pissed, thinking he was just trying to mess with me, and went back to his tent. But when I got there, The tent was still zipped up, and I could hear him faintly snoring inside. I don't know what it was I saw, but it looked, sounded, and walked exactly like my friend. I had been drinking a bit, but not enough to hallucinate. He swears he never left his tent, and he denies walking through the woods ahead of me.